there's no political will behind them. Incidentally, everyone I know in the Great Lakes area says that the UN peacekeepers are also complicit in the smuggling of minerals. Which takes us to Rwanda. And there, the problem was not with the peacekeepers on the ground, but the people in New York who absolutely refused to hear what was happening when the UN commander realized that there were huge arms caches that had been built up. Which brings us to Darfur, where the UN is so intimidated by the genocidal government regime, I should say, in Khartoum, that not only do they run their humanitarian reports past officials in Khartoum before they publish them, they've actually stopped doing humanitarian assessments because it upset the people in Khartoum so much. Not only are they not protecting civilians, but certainly all the refugees that I've spoken to, they actually believe that the UN peacekeepers are on the side of the Khartoum regime. So not a great success, really. What else do we do? Peace talks, of course. Our diplomats love peace talks, but to me, it's the way we approach them that is often the problem. We assume all the parties to the peace talks are rational people. We don't get the fact that some of them actually want to kill lots of their own citizens. And of course, we assume that they want peace. I'm reminded of a story from Bosnia of a friend of mine who went with the UNHCR to see the Bosnian Serb mayor of Banja Luka about trying to get some Bosnian refugees. This is right after the war, trying to get some Bosnian Muslim refugees to come back to Banja Luka, to their old houses. And the UNHCR guy was going through all the things that needed to do. And finally, the mayor of Banja Luka brought his fist down, bang, on the table and said, "How many more Muslims do we have to kill before you people get the message?" So I am going to use Darfur as an example of what I have been talking about. There it is on the left of your screen. I think most of you probably know the detail of what is happening in Darfur. It started in 2003. Part of the reason is climate change, because the Sahara is moving south, and that the nomads who used to live there now don't have anywhere to graze their beasts, and so their government has told them to go to Darfur and to kill the black Africans there, and the government has armed them. And so far, 90% of the black African villages have been destroyed, and it is systematic, and 300,000 Darfuris have died, about 2 million have been displaced. It's no longer a subject of any interest, I have to say, and it's really, really hard to get any attention whatsoever for it. It isn't just the economic reason that is causing this. It is also a genocidal ideology, because the government in Khartoum have a vision of Sudan as purely Arab and purely Muslim. Now, the people in Darfur are Muslim, but they're the wrong kind of Muslim because they're black, and that doesn't count. So they want to cleanse all of Sudan of people who are black African in their ethnicity, and they killed 2 million people in the south, which then broke away, big surprise, and they're still killing the people in Darfur. What my group did is we collected 500 drawings by Darfuri children showing the genocide as they had seen it, because as all of you know, if you want to have a good genocide, you keep the press out, keep the media out, so there are no images. So there are very few images of what's been happening in Darfur. We brought out 500 of these drawings by children, and they were accepted by the International Criminal Court as evidence of the context of what has been happening there. The people in Khartoum say it's nothing to do with race, and yet look how those kids draw the different colored skin. They draw the victims with black skin, and they draw the people who self-identify as Arab with a sort of red skin. Notice also the looting going on there at the bottom, somebody taking somebody's ghetto blaster. Again, the skin color. This picture, if you look in your far right-hand corner, That illustrates young women and girls being chained by the neck and led away to slavery. This is happening right now in Darfur. I've interviewed so many people who say that they basically when they go into a village, they kill the men, they throw the children on fires, they set fire to the houses, and they take the young girls and the women who are attractive to distribute among the Sudanese army generals as slaves. When they systematically rape the women and girls, they call them to their face Abid, which means slave, and they brand a lot of the women as well. General Bashir, the Field Marshal Bashir who runs Sudan, says none of this is happening. He says it's all a Zionist plot and that people like me are Israeli spies and trying to besmirch the reputation of Sudan, but he also says rape doesn't happen in Islam. He says that that is part of our corrupt Western culture, but that all of those women who say that they've been raped are lying and that they're probably prostitutes. But to get an insight into how he treats women in Sudan, in Khartoum state alone, each year, 43,000 women are flogged, beaten publicly, and their crime is wearing jeans. And that is an offense against public decency, but their real crime is that they are girls going to school. And that is so offensive to this regime that that's how they act. So, here's the reason why very little happens. Russia and China are both selling arms to Darfur, and China is buying the oil. Also, Russia and China are very keen to have a precedent of no intervention so that they can get on with whatever they want to do to their own populations in places like Chechnya and among the Uyghur people, the Muslim people in China. France is always an interesting case, and I don't mean to insult any French people here in the audience. I'm talking about your government, but quite often there is an economic consideration whether there's business to be done that dictates what France does. The USA and the UK, the terrible twosome, obviously the UK just does what the Americans tell them to. It used to be that they would avert their eyes from human rights abuses because of communism, that the most hideous dictator in Africa could get away with what he wanted because he was on our side in the war against communism. Well, that's over now, but now we have the war on terror. So now we judge everybody according to whether they're on our side in the war on terror. And it so happens that the people in Sudan we believe, have allowed drones to be based there. Also, we sent people there to be tortured. So they get away with anything they want. So what is to be done? First of all, this is a photograph taken in a medical tent in Darfur on a doctor's cell phone. And the reason this person had just been brought in, this young man had just been brought in. And the reason I'm showing this to you is that this is the real face of what genocide is. Look at the look of terror on this person's face. Now, what do we do about this? Clearly, military armed intervention is really not going to work, is it? Because let's think back to why Rwanda and Bosnia were allowed to happen. It was because 18 American soldiers died in Somalia. That was basically it. The world lost its appetite for intervention. And the reason Sudan has been allowed to continue is because we made such a disastrous mess of Iraq. And there was no stomach, no political will to take on another Arab regime. And why isn't anyone going to do something about Syria? Well, that could be because of Libya, because we offended the Russians so much by not getting them on board, on agreeing to go into Libya, that we are not going to be able to get their help, and they're being very stubborn over Syria. Some people say, oh, well, we need new laws. I don't think we do. I think all the laws are there. It's a question of actually enforcing them. There are a pile to go back to Darfur, there are a pile of UN resolutions on Darfur. We've just chosen not to enforce them. And the other problem is that our diplomats send mixed messages. On the one hand, they talk about peace and human rights, but on the other hand, they're trying to sell them things. and we signal our weakness. We pass these resolutions at the UN, and then no one does anything. And if you were a dictator, what conclusion would you draw from that? But so what can we do? Enforce those resolutions. I think we should use smart sanctions much more. We should use soft power. We should treat these people like narco criminals. And I say that because when I came back from my first visit to Darfur in 2004, I was dragged into a bizarre meeting at the Houses of Parliament in London to speak to a group of people. And in the front row was the Sudanese ambassador to London. And he looked rather bored when I talked about all the women who were being raped and the children being thrown on fires. And then I got to the bit where I said, and what I think we need to do is put a travel ban on the architects of the genocide. And at that point, he went completely ape, because I'd made it personal to him. And I thought, duh, this is what we should be doing. Really. The other thing is that a lot of these genocidal regimes and human rights abusers, they sign a whole bunch of international treaties, and we never hold them to it. All of these conventions, they've signed them on human rights, but because they want to be able to turn up to nice UN events and swan around like important guys, but we never hold them to it. If only we had the will that we put into economic law on trade and on copyright. If we can put that kind of effort into that, we can do it on human rights as well. We could also start in making countries enforce their own human rights laws and constitutions. A lot of countries have adopted very nice, on paper, it sounds great. What we should be doing is putting sanctions on them for actually breaking their own promises to their own people. We should be backing the human rights advocates and the civil society people within those countries, because everything comes down to the credibility of the messenger. And it shouldn't be a white person like me going into these places. We should be supporting the local people with the credibility. The role of regional bodies is vastly overlooked. People like the African Union, have been such a disappointment, and yet there is a capacity there to put peer pressure on fellow countries. We could actually start suing the UN peacekeeping forces for failing to act up to their Chapter 7 mandates. How about that? Then we could make the International Criminal Court a little bit more credible by not having a bunch of black faces in the dock. How about indicting Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney for an illegal war? Then the ICC might have a bit more credibility in the Arab and Muslim world and the African world as well. So are we just going to keep going through the motions? I fear we are, and I hope not. You've had enough of looking at that picture. The thought I want to leave you with is this. I've shown you victims, but what keeps me going back to the countries I work in Africa with a humble heart is that those people do not define themselves as victims. They say they are survivors. They have a resilience and a resourcefulness that shames us. And for every act of genocide, I promise you there is a corresponding act of human decency and beauty. It's just not coming from the international community. I think of a woman I know in Rwanda called Patricia, gang raped during the genocide, saw her husband and her 4 children killed in front of her. And when I met Patricia 10 years ago, she had 3 children, and I didn't understand why. And somebody said to me, she adopted them. Shortly after the genocide ended, she found these 3 children, orphans, on the road, and she adopted them. Well, Patricia can hardly feed herself. She lives in a hut with almost nothing. And I said to her, Patricia, why did you do this? You just made your life so much more difficult. And she looked at me as if I was insane. And she said, it was the right thing to do. It's time for us to do the right thing.